early model JK with a 6-speed manual transmission and a L94 Gen 4 6.2 LS engine. You can use the NSG 370, which is the stock 6-speed manual transmission. You will have to replace the case because the JK engine has the small bell housing for the minivans versus the larger bell housing that the TJ used with a 4-liter. The other option is just to use a TJ transmission. You can use an adapter that's available that will run a full-size clutch, and that transmission will take about 300 horsepower in our experience. It's not going to take much more, which basically means you're limited to a 5.3 at the most, in my opinion. You want to step up from there, you can go with an MVG 4500. It's a great transmission. It is a truck transmission with a granny low, so it's not the best shifting transmission for a performance engine like a 6.2. But if you have a 6.0 or a 5.3 and you want to do expedition, it's a good combination. We've done those. This Jeep has a Tremec 6-speed, which is pretty much top of the pile. It's an expensive transmission, but it shifts fast, it's really strong, and it's got 6 gears. It's not a 5-speed. In this Jeep, we're running an LS7 flywheel, LS7 pressure plate and disc, LS1 slave cylinder. We're running the stock JK master cylinder. Everything pretty much just bolted together. The overall length of this combination is longer than an automatic. Now, if you grew up like I did back in the 70s and 80s, we loved manual transmissions for a lot of reasons. One, they were basically faster than the automatics of the time if you knew how to shift. They used less horsepower, less friction, less heat. But you got to remember, back then we were dealing with the C6 transmissions, we were dealing with the 3-speed turbo hydramatics, we were dealing with the 4-speed 700R4 and other variations the other manufacturers had. And the bottom line is those transmissions left a lot to be desired. They were valve body driven transmissions. They were not software driven. They were pretty strong for the most part, but the gearing was somewhat lacking. If you look at a modern transmission like a new 8L90 with a 4.6 low and a 0.6 overdrive, we didn't have anything like that in the early days. Gearing wasn't that great in the 3 and 4 speeds, and even the JK right up through 11 ran a 4-speed transmission that was a throwback. That transmission robbed the 3.8 of the power that it had, and it really took an engine that wasn't that bad of an engine and turned it into a boat anchor. The 5-speed was a big improvement. However, the 8-speed's even a bigger step than that. When you compare a manual transmission to a modern automatic, I think the automatic's gonna come out on top. Why? Well, you have one thing called torque multiplication. Torque multiplication is where the torque converter is basically slipping, and you can change the rate of that slippage. So you can apply tremendous torque off the line, or if you're just out off-roading, the computer can control the torque converter clutch and get you that torque multiplication. That's something you really can't do precisely with a manual. Yes, you can feather the clutch, but it's really not a proper thing to do. The automatics are incredibly strong. At least if you look at the 6L80 and the 8L90, they can handle 700 foot-pounds of torque plus. Now, this transmission I'm driving now can handle that torque. Some of the modern automatics even have launch control. So there's just so many advantages, in my opinion, to the automatic over the manual. However, there are some advantages to the manual over the automatic. So what are the advantages of the manual? One, they're fun to drive. Two, some guys make arguments about off-road capabilities that the automatic doesn't have. One, for example, is going up a steep incline. And let's say your Jeep's going to come over. The front end's going to come over the top. You can push the clutch in faster than you can throw it into neutral. Okay, I'll give you that, but how many times are you going to be in that situation? Two, rocking the clutch pedal. Let's say you're stuck in a snowbank. Well, you can apply torque to the wheels more accurately with a clutch by pulsing it than you can by throwing an automatic into reverse and drive. You just can't do it as effectively. However, again, how many times are you going to be in that situation? So there are a few situations where the manual, in my opinion, has an advantage over the automatic, but there's more situations where the automatic has an advantage over the manual. Off-road, I find the manual is good, but not as good as the automatic, and here's a couple of examples. Let's say you're on a steep uphill and you have to launch. Well, you can put your e-brake on to keep from rolling backwards, and some modern vehicles have something called hill start assist, and that's where they'll apply the brakes for you so you can get moving forward. But in the old days, if you push that clutch in on a steep hill, you're going to roll backwards, possibly rolling into the person behind you. On a downhill, manuals work pretty good, but again, when you shift an automatic transmission, you always have torque being applied to those wheels. So if you're going down a hill and you have something called RPM match shifting, that's where the electronics know that you're going to go from one gear to the next, whether it's up or down, and it revs the engine to match the next gear. What that does is it transitions the shift so it's so smooth you keep constant wheel speed. That can be a big bonus going uphill or downhill, or even in sand. You guys ever had to shift a manual transmission in sand? For that momentary second that you push that clutch in and you lose power going to the wheels, and yes, you can do it quickly, but you could dig yourself into the sand and get stuck. Where with an automatic, that torque gets applied evenly and constantly to those wheels, so you have a more constant wheel speed. So I'm not saying the manual's a bad deal. It's not. It's fun to drive. They're very functional. They are fuel efficient. That's another advantage that we should talk about. Manual transmissions for years have had less friction and less heat than the automatic. We were seeing 2 miles to the gallon better with the manual than we were seeing with the early automatics. It's not so much true today. When the 6L80 came out back in the mid-2000s, GM started rating the manuals and the automatics pretty close to each other for miles per gallon. 6L80 is a clutch-to-clutch transmission and it's low friction. Compared to the 4-speeds, when you combined the diverse gearing and the low friction, we now are approaching the efficiency of a manual transmission. A lot of manufacturers dropped the manual transmissions, even the performance manufacturers like Lamborghini, Porsche. They came out with sophisticated automatics because these automatic transmissions can shift in microseconds, which no clutch can ever do. But what they realized was there's a whole bunch of guys out there, especially baby boomers, that want the manual transmission experience. So they started to offer the manual transmission again, and I'm glad to see that GM has come back out with manual transmissions in the Corvette and the Camaro, because it's not just about how fast you can go, it's about how much fun you can have. I used to live in California. I used to run Mulholland and Coldwater and all those canyon trails, and it is a lot funner with a manual than it is with an automatic, even if you can go faster with an automatic. So what it really comes down to is either transmission is going to push your JK down the road. Like everything else, it's what do you want versus what do you need. If your JK is a grocery getter, your wife drives it to the store, or it's a daily driver, you're probably going to stay with an automatic. If your JK is for fun, it's a second, third vehicle, you tow it to the trail, or you're going to take it on a trip with your family to Moab, the manual might work for you because the manual is fun to drive for those trips, where the automatic is more practical for everyday use. Now, of course, this is my opinion. Everybody has their own opinion. Most of the guys I talk to that want a manual transmission don't want it because it's faster or even for the fuel economy. They want it because the fun factor, because they like driving the manual transmission. And I think we can make the argument today that the automatic transmission has approached the efficiency of the manual transmission, and as far as performance goes, I don't think you're going to be beating the automatic with a manual. If you look at the launch control that these new automatics have, the incredibly low first gears, the diverse gearing, so that even though you have 40s and 488s, you can still launch off the line hard, but then get on the highway and cruise at 1700 RPM at 70 miles an hour. These automatics are really changing the game. Now I can get to 80 miles an hour in this Jeep and cruise just over 2000 RPM, which is great. Launching off the line is great in this Jeep, but you got to remember, if I want to thrash this Jeep and fry the tires, I could do that. But I really don't want to do that and abuse the clutch, because if I do, I'm going to end up wrecking my clutch, replacing the pressure plate, disc, bearing, whatever. With an automatic and a torque converter, it doesn't place the same amount of stress on the drivetrain that the manual does. Now don't get me wrong, an LT with an 8-speed has tremendous torque. In fact, GM has to limit the torque so you don't break parts. If you remove that torque management, you can start breaking parts, and I can tell you that from experience. So the manual transmission is a good deal if that's what you want for fun. So in today's world, I think everybody has agreed the automatic is best for most people. That's for guys that drive around town, guys that are off-road. I've had trail bosses tell me that driving the automatic with tap shift is like cheating off-road. You don't really have to worry about what gear you're in anymore. You don't have to really worry about losing wheel speed during shifts. Or if you're in the sand, you can set maximum gear so you don't bog the engine down. The automatic's not going to bog down. You can set maximum gear, let's say to third. You can launch on that sandbar. You're going to maintain constant wheel speed right up through those shifts, and then you're not going to upshift into fourth and bog down. I remember back in the day in the 70s and 80s, we used to have the debate what was faster on the track, a manual or automatic. And I used to run LT1s, the early LT1s from the early 1970s, in Camaros and Corvette. Somebody that was really good with a manual could outrun an automatic, because the automatics pretty much sucked back then. A built automatic with a shift kit and modified valve body and all that would take the manual in most cases. So what it really came down to was driver experience. Today with an automatic, driver experience is built into your vehicle. You just simply throw it into gear and go. If you know how to operate a modern automatic, you have extra advantages. Things like gear lock, tap shift, maximum gear. These are things that are available to you that most guys don't even know about. So what I'll say about the manual transmission is it's been a staple of the automotive industry for over 100 years, and while manufacturers are phasing it out for efficiencies and drivability and other reasons, there's still a place for it in my opinion. The Jeep is not the most efficient vehicle out there. After World War II, Jeeps had manual transmissions. They were reliable. After World War II, a bunch of automatics appeared, the Hydramatics, the Torque Flights, etc. And they were good transmissions, but they couldn't match the manual for efficiency and reliability. In the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of advancements in the automatic, but I still think the manual ruled when it came to the basic things. In the 80s and 90s, when 4 speeds and then 5 speed, and then of course the 6 speeds eventually came out, I think the automatic took over the manuals. Okay, so here we are off-road with the manual transmission JK. We're in 4-wheel drive low. That's 4th gear. We're going to jump right from 4th to 6th because of the slow ratio. So we're in 6th gear right now. Cruising along 20 miles an hour, 1200 RPM. So you can see you can pretty good speed up with that 6th gear overdrive. We're going to shift now on the fly.